It was late afternoon when the sidewalks were full of people heading home from work. Cars lined up at red lights, horns honking every few seconds, and the smell of roasted nuts from a nearby cart filled the air. Among all this noise and rush, no one noticed the old woman standing near the corner. Her coat looked too heavy for the warm weather, and her gray hair was messy, sticking out from under a small hat. She held a worn handbag close to her chest as if afraid someone might take it away. Her eyes moved from one face to another, searching, hoping someone would stop and help her. She whispered something to a passing man, but he just shook his head and walked faster. Another woman looked at her but turned away as soon as their eyes met. Everyone was in a hurry, too busy with their phones or their own thoughts to care. The old woman stepped closer to the edge of the road, trying to read the street signs, but her vision was weak. She rubbed her temples and looked lost, like she had woken up in a strange place. Minutes passed, and the crowd kept moving around her like a river around a rock. She tried again to ask for help, her voice shaking, but people only stared for a second before walking away. Someone laughed nearby, not at her, but the sound made her flinch. She was clearly frightened, unsure of where to go or what to do next. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out a piece of paper with a scribbled address on it. She stared at it for a long time, as if trying to remember why it mattered. A cold wind brushed against her face, and she pulled her coat tighter. She whispered something to herself, perhaps a name or a memory. People kept passing by, pretending not to see. One man even took out his phone and started filming her for a few seconds before walking away, shaking his head. To everyone else, she looked like just another lost soul on the street. But there was something different about her eyes. They were full of pain, but also of kindness, as if she had lived through better days and still wanted to believe in people. The sun was slowly setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. The old woman's breathing became heavier as she tried to cross the street. Cars rushed by, and the sound of engines made her freeze. She took a step back, gripping her bag tightly. For a moment, she looked ready to cry. A group of young people walked past her, laughing, not even noticing her struggle. She whispered again, her words lost in the noise of the city. A police car drove by but didn't stop. She waved weakly, but the officer didn't see her. Her eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them with the sleeve of her coat. She felt invisible, as if the whole world had turned its back on her. Her steps were slow and unsteady, and she looked around again, trying to find a familiar sign or face. Everything looked the same: cold buildings, busy people, and endless traffic. She sat down on a low wall near a small store. Her feet hurt from walking for so long. She reached into her bag again, taking out a small photo of a man and a young child. Her hands shook as she held it close, whispering something under her breath. Maybe it was the name of her husband, maybe her son or grandson. Her lips trembled as she looked around, hoping someone would notice her and ask if she was okay. But no one did. The people who passed by only glanced at her with quick, uncomfortable eyes. Some thought she was homeless. Others just didn't want to get involved. A young mother pulled her little girl closer as they walked past, whispering something the old woman couldn't hear. It hurt, but she didn't blame them. She just wanted someone to listen, someone to help her find her way home. Time seemed to slow down. The streetlights flickered on, and the world around her began to change color. The once bright sky turned soft orange and purple. The old woman took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She thought of her house, her warm living room, the soft chair by the window, and the smell of fresh flowers she always kept on the table. She missed it so much. She didn't understand how she had ended up so far from home. One moment she was walking to the park she loved, and the next, she was standing in a place she didn't recognize. She stood up again, determined to keep walking. Her legs were weak, but she moved slowly, step by step. Her mind drifted between confusion and small flashes of memory. She remembered her son's smile, the sound of her late husband's laughter, the taste of tea in the morning. Those memories kept her moving. She believed someone would help her soon. As she crossed another street, a group of teenagers on bicycles rode past her, making her step back quickly. One of them turned his head, slowing down for a second. He looked at her, really looked, and noticed the fear in her eyes. He stopped, watching her from a distance. She seemed scared and lost, standing there under the streetlight. But his friends called him to hurry up, and he turned away, unsure what to do. The old woman stood still, hugging her bag again, whispering, "Please, someone help me." The shops began to close one by one and the sidewalks emptied. The air grew cooler, and the sound of traffic faded as the night deepened. The old woman found herself standing in front of a bakery window, looking at the leftover bread inside. Her stomach growled softly. She reached into her coat pocket and found a few coins. It wasn't much, but she stepped inside and asked the man behind the counter if she could buy something small. Her voice was shaky but polite. The man nodded, handing her a piece of bread. He didn't ask questions, just gave a small smile. For the first time that day, she felt a bit of warmth. She sat on a bench outside, eating slowly. The bread tasted simple but comforting. She watched the world move around her, the buses, the lights, the people heading home. She wondered if anyone at her home was looking for her, if someone was worried. She hoped so. She whispered to herself, "They'll find me. They have to." Her eyes grew tired and she leaned back on the bench, resting for a moment. A light drizzle began to fall and she pulled her coat tighter again. She didn't have an umbrella, but she didn't mind the rain. It reminded her of her garden, the one she used to tend every morning. She smiled faintly, remembering the smell of wet soil and flowers, but soon her smile faded as she looked around. The streets were almost empty now. Only a few people passed by, umbrellas in hand, walking quickly to avoid the rain. None of them looked her way. Her thoughts grew heavier. She wondered how the world had changed so much. Years ago, she used to talk to strangers easily. People smiled at each other, helped each other. Now everyone seemed too busy, too afraid to care. She sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that comes from years of holding back tears. Her eyes closed for a second and she whispered a prayer, asking for strength, asking for someone kind enough to stop. A bus passed by, splashing water near her feet. She blinked and looked up at the tall buildings glowing in the rain. Somewhere in those buildings, people were laughing, eating dinner, safe and warm. She missed that feeling. She wanted to go home, but she didn't know how. The rain got heavier and she decided to move under a nearby awning. She walked carefully, trying not to slip. The sound of raindrops hitting the ground filled the air. She stood there watching the wet streets reflect the city lights. Despite everything, there was still a strange beauty in it. She held her handbag close and whispered again, "Please let someone notice me." Just then, from across the street, someone did. A young person walking with a backpack stopped for a moment, looking in her direction. The old woman didn't notice yet, but for the first time that day, someone was paying attention. Someone saw her not as a stranger, but as a person who needed help. The city kept moving, but in that small moment, something quietly began to change. The rain had stopped by the time the young person crossed the street. The city lights shimmered on the wet road, and puddles reflected the glow of passing cars. The old woman was still standing under the awning, her eyes fixed on the ground, unaware that someone was walking toward her. Her coat was soaked at the edges and her hair clung to her face. She looked tired, as if every step she had taken that day had drained what little strength she had left. The young man, tall and carrying a worn backpack, hesitated for a moment before speaking. He didn't want to scare her, so he spoke softly. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you all right?" His voice was calm and gentle. The old woman looked up slowly, blinking as if trying to focus. For a second, she didn't answer. She just stared, unsure if he was really talking to her. Then she said in a trembling voice, "I think I'm lost." He took a small step closer but kept a respectful distance. "It's okay," he said kindly. "Do you remember where you were going?" She shook her head and reached into her handbag, pulling out the same crumpled paper she had looked at before. The rain had smudged some of the ink, but an address could still be seen. The young man took the paper gently, reading it under the streetlight. It was an address from another part of town, far from where they were. He nodded slowly. "That's a bit far," he said, "but don't worry, we'll figure it out." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "People kept walking past me," she whispered. No one would listen. He smiled a little. "Well, I'm listening now." He looked around for a taxi, but the streets were nearly empty. He offered her his arm, but she hesitated before taking it. Her hand was cold, and he could feel how lightly she leaned on him, as if afraid to be a burden. Together, they began walking slowly down the street, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the faint hum of the city. As they walked, he asked gentle questions. "What's your name?" She hesitated, trying to remember. "My name is Margaret," she finally said softly, as if she hadn't spoken it in a long time. "All right, Miss Margaret," he said. "I'm glad I found you." She gave a weak smile. "You're the first person who stopped," she said quietly. "I thought maybe I had become invisible." Her words hit him hard, and for a while they both walked in silence. When they reached a small bus stop, he helped her sit down on the bench. The streets were darker now, and only a few cars passed by. He sat beside her, thinking about what to do next. "Do you have any family?" he asked gently. She nodded slowly. "My son. He's waiting for me," she said, looking confused. "But I can't remember how to get home." He decided to use his phone to call for help. He tried the address she had given him on a map app, but it was far across the city. He could take her there, but he didn't have enough money for a taxi. He didn't want to leave her alone, though. She looked too fragile to be by herself for even a moment. He thought for a while and then said, "Let's go to the police station nearby. They'll help you get home." She nodded, trusting him completely. The walk to the station wasn't long, but it felt endless for her. Every few steps she needed to rest. He slowed down, matching her pace. When they passed a closed flower shop, she stopped for a moment and smiled faintly at the display behind the glass. "I used to love roses," she said softly. "I had a garden full of them." He smiled. "That sounds beautiful." She nodded, her eyes distant, lost in a memory. "I used to sit outside every morning and watch the sun rise," she said. It felt like the world was gentle then. He didn't interrupt her. He just listened. They finally reached the small police station at the corner of the street. The building was quiet, with only one officer sitting at the front desk. The young man guided her inside, helping her sit on a chair. The officer looked up from his computer, surprised to see them. "Can I help you?" he asked. The young man explained what had happened, how he had found her alone in the rain, lost and frightened. The officer stood and approached the woman kindly. "Ma'am, can I see your ID?" She reached into her handbag again, her fingers trembling as she handed it over. The officer looked at it and raised his eyebrows. "Margaret Dawson," he said softly. "We've been looking for you all day." He quickly made a call, informing someone that she had been found safe. The young man watched as the old woman sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap. She looked relieved but exhausted. After the call, the officer turned to him. "Her family has been worried sick," he said. "They've been searching everywhere." The young man nodded. "I'm just glad she's safe now." While they waited, the officer brought her a cup of warm tea. She smiled weakly as she took it, holding it with both hands to stop them from shaking. The young man sat beside her, making sure she wasn't alone. She looked at him and said softly, "You remind me of my grandson." He smiled, touched by her words. "I'm sure he's lucky to have you," he said. She shook her head slightly. "He doesn't visit much anymore," she said sadly. "Everyone's so busy these days." Before long, a car pulled up outside. A man and a woman rushed in, both looking worried and out of breath. When the woman saw Margaret, she gasped and ran forward, wrapping her arms around her. "Mom!" she cried. The old woman smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "I'm here, dear," she whispered. The young man stood back, not wanting to interrupt their reunion. The officer explained how he had found her, and the family turned to thank him. The woman looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for helping her," she said. "We didn't know where to look. She wandered off from home this morning, and we've been terrified." He nodded shyly. She just needed someone to stop and listen. They offered him money, but he shook his head. "No, it's okay," he said. "I just did what anyone should do." The old woman reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're a good soul," she whispered. "Don't ever lose that." He smiled, not sure what to say. After a few more words of thanks, the family helped her into the car. Before leaving, she looked out the window and waved at him. He waved back, watching as the car disappeared into the distance. The street was quiet again, and the sound of rain had returned softly in the background. He stood there for a moment, feeling both heavy and peaceful inside. That night, as he walked home, he couldn't stop thinking about her. How everyone had ignored her. How lonely she had looked. He thought about his own grandmother, who lived alone in another town. He promised himself he'd call her the next day. Sometimes, he realized, all people need is someone to care enough to stop. When he finally got home, he took off his wet jacket and sat down by the window. The city looked calm from there, the lights reflecting in the puddles below. He closed his eyes and thought about the old woman's smile, the way she had looked when she realized she wasn't alone anymore. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. Across the city, in a warm living room, Margaret sat on her couch with a blanket over her legs. Her daughter made her tea while her son called the doctor just to make sure she was all right. She looked around her home, the pictures on the wall, the familiar smell of lavender, and she felt safe again. But she couldn't stop thinking about the kind stranger who had held her hand when no one else did. She whispered a prayer for him before closing her eyes. Neither of them knew how much that small act of kindness would change their lives forever. For her, it was proof that good people still existed in a world that had grown cold. For him, it was a reminder that compassion still had power. The night grew quiet, but in two hearts a new warmth had begun to grow, unseen but real, like a candle that refused to go out. The next morning, the sunlight filled the small living room with a warm glow. Margaret sat near the window, a soft blanket over her lap and a cup of tea in her trembling hands. The sound of birds outside mixed with the faint hum of the city. Her daughter had just left for work, reminding her to lock the door and call if she needed anything. Margaret nodded, though she still felt uneasy. Her memory had become cloudy lately. The doctor said it was normal for her age, but she could feel parts of her mind slipping away like pages torn out of a book. She looked down at her hands and sighed. They were thin and pale, marked with time and years of hard work. She remembered when those same hands used to plant flowers, cook meals, and hold the hands of her children when they were young. Now they trembled when she tried to hold a spoon. She missed the strength she once had. Her mind drifted to the night before. The image of that kind young man helping her through the rain wouldn't leave her thoughts. His calm voice, his patience, the way he didn't treat her like a burden, all of it warmed her heart. She wished she had asked for his name. She wanted to thank him properly. She took another sip of her tea and looked out the window, hoping maybe she'd see him walk by, though she knew that was just wishful thinking. Later that afternoon, her daughter returned home with groceries. She looked tired from work, but still smiled when she saw her mother sitting by the window. "Feeling better today?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "Just thinking," she replied, "about the boy who helped me." Her daughter smiled kindly. "You were lucky someone good found you, Mom. The world can be careless these days." Margaret nodded again, her eyes distant. "I think he was an angel," she whispered. Her daughter chuckled lightly, though her eyes grew soft. Maybe he was. Days passed and life slowly returned to normal. Margaret spent her mornings near the garden, tending to her flowers as best she could. Her roses were blooming again, red and full, and she liked to talk to them as she watered the soil. Sometimes she would tell them about her life, about her late husband, about the young man who had helped her. Talking to the flowers made her feel less alone. One afternoon, while she was in the garden, the sound of the gate opening startled her. She turned around to see a familiar figure standing there, the same young man holding a small bouquet of white lilies. For a moment, she couldn't believe her eyes. "Oh my goodness," she said softly, her heart racing. "It's you." He smiled shyly, stepping closer. "I just wanted to check if you were all right," he said. "The officer gave me your address when I asked about you." Her eyes filled with tears. "You came all the way here just to see me?" He nodded. "I couldn't stop thinking about you. I wanted to make sure you got home safe." She reached out a trembling hand and he took it gently. "You're a kind soul," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't have many visitors these days. It means a lot that you came." He smiled, handing her the flowers. "I thought you might like these." She smelled them and smiled faintly. "They remind me of my husband. He used to bring me lilies every Sunday." They walked to the small wooden bench near the garden and sat down. The afternoon sun was warm, and the air smelled of fresh soil. For a while they just talked about life, about how the city had changed, about small things that didn't really matter but made time feel soft and kind. He told her about his life, how he worked part-time after school, how he was saving up for college, and how he wanted to study architecture. She listened with bright eyes, nodding as if every word meant something special. "You're a good young man," she said quietly. "You'll do great things one day." He smiled and shrugged. "I just want to build something that lasts." She looked at him thoughtfully. "The best things that last aren't built with hands," she said. "They're built with heart." They laughed together for a while, sharing small stories and bits of their lives. Time seemed to slow down. The warmth between them felt natural, like a friendship that had always been waiting to happen. Before leaving, he promised to visit again soon. She nodded, smiling as he walked away. As the gate closed behind him, She whispered a small prayer of thanks. Over the next few weeks, he kept his promise. He would visit her every few days, sometimes after school, sometimes on weekends. They would sit in the garden, drink tea, and talk for hours. He often helped her with small things, fixing the fence, trimming the plants, or carrying groceries. Her daughter noticed how much brighter her mother seemed these days. She smiled whenever she saw them talking, though she couldn't help but feel curious about why this stranger cared so much. One day, as they sat under the old tree, she told him stories from her past, how she and her husband had built their home from nothing, how they had struggled during hard times, and how they had raised their only child with love and patience. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her eyes shone with pride. "We didn't have much money," she said, "but we had each other." That was enough. He listened quietly, admiring the strength in her words. Then she sighed and looked down. "When he passed away, everything felt empty. I didn't know what to do with myself. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people. The world kept moving, and I just stood still." He reached out gently, placing his hand on hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I know," she whispered. "You brought light back into my days." From that day, their bond grew stronger. Sometimes they walked to the nearby park together, where children played and couples strolled. The old woman would smile as she watched them, remembering her younger days. The young man would carry her bag and walk beside her, listening to her soft laughter. People often looked at them curiously, wondering about their unlikely friendship, but neither of them cared. They understood each other in ways words couldn't describe. One afternoon, as they walked back from the park, she suddenly stopped and looked at him seriously. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "If one day I forget who you are," she began, her voice trembling, "promise me you won't stop visiting." He looked at her with warmth and said, "You'll never forget me. But even if you do, I'll still come." She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. That's all I needed to hear. As weeks passed, she began to trust him more deeply. She told him about her fears, about getting older, about her fading memory, about the loneliness that sometimes crept into her heart. He never interrupted, never tried to fix her pain. He just listened. And sometimes that was all she needed. In return, she shared her wisdom, reminding him of the importance of kindness, patience, and gratitude. Their talks became a quiet exchange of lessons between two souls from different worlds, but connected by something simple and human. One day, while helping her organize old boxes from the attic, he found a photo album filled with pictures of her younger days. Wedding photos, family gatherings, holidays long gone. She smiled as she looked through them, her fingers tracing the faded edges. "This was my whole life," she said softly. "It goes by so fast. You think you'll remember every detail, but time has its own way of taking things." He helped her place the photos carefully back into the box, and she looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for helping me, but for reminding me that I still matter." When he left that evening, she stood by the gate watching him walk away. The wind carried the faint scent of roses, and she felt a deep peace in her heart. She knew life was unpredictable, but she also knew something good had entered hers again, and for the first time in a long while she didn't feel forgotten. That night, as she sat by the window, the stars shining above, she smiled quietly. Somewhere out there she knew someone cared. The loneliness that had once filled her home now felt lighter, replaced by a small growing hope. She whispered softly into the night, "Thank you, not just to the boy who helped her, but to life itself for giving her a second chance to feel connected again." The sun was soft that morning, filtering through the curtains in gentle golden lines. The old woman sat at her table, folding a napkin slowly as the kettle whistled on the stove. She had already set out 2 cups, one for herself and one for the young man who always came by on Saturdays. Her hands shook a little, but her smile was calm. It had become their small ritual, these visits. The sound of footsteps outside brought warmth to her heart before the knock even came. He greeted her with his usual grin and a paper bag in hand. "I brought your favorite," he said. Inside was a small box of pastries from the bakery down the street. She laughed softly. "You remember everything," she said, taking the bag. "Of course," he replied. "How could I forget the lady who taught me how to make real tea?" They sat together in the kitchen, the sound of clinking cups filling the quiet air. The young man told her about his week, his studies, his part-time job, the challenges he faced balancing both. She listened, nodding, her eyes warm with pride. "You work hard," she said softly. "That's rare these days," he smiled. "I learned it from you," he said, half joking. She chuckled. "You give me too much credit." After they finished eating, she invited him into the garden. The roses were blooming brighter than ever. The air smelled sweet and full of life. She watched him gently clip away a few dry branches, careful not to hurt the plants. "You have a patient hand," she said. "You'd be good at gardening." He smiled without looking up. "Maybe one day I'll have a garden like this," he said. "A place that feels alive." They spent hours talking about small things, music, food, the neighbors, the memories that made her laugh. It was simple, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. For her, these moments were treasures. For him, they were lessons. He didn't realize it then, but every story she shared was quietly shaping how he saw the world. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of the old tree, she suddenly grew quiet. Her gaze drifted far away and her hands tightened around her cup. He noticed the change and asked softly, "Are you okay?" She blinked as if returning from a distant place. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "I forget what day it is, or what I was just saying. It scares me." He looked at her kindly. "It's all right," he said. "Everyone forgets things sometimes." She smiled weakly. "Not like this," she whispered. "It feels like parts of me are slipping away." He didn't know what to say at first. Then he reached over and placed his hand over hers. "Even if you forget things," he said gently, "you'll never be alone. I'll be here." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're too kind," she said softly. "I don't deserve this." He shook his head. "You deserve all the kindness in the world." The weeks passed quietly, but she began to grow more fragile. Her steps slowed, her hands trembled more, and her memory began to fade faster. Sometimes when he came over, she would pause before recognizing him. It broke his heart a little each time, but he never showed it. He would smile, remind her who he was, and talk to her as if nothing was wrong. And when she did remember, her face would light up with joy as though she had just found an old friend she thought was gone forever. One evening, while they sat watching the sunset, she spoke suddenly. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about life lately," she said. "About how it's not measured by how long we live, but by how deeply we touch others." He nodded slowly, taking in her words. "You've touched a lot of lives," he said sincerely. She shook her head. "Maybe once," she said. "But now I think the only life I've touched lately is yours." He smiled. "That's more than enough." She looked at him with soft eyes. "When you get older," she said, "promise me something." "Anything," he replied. "Promise me you won't grow cold. The world can be hard and people will disappoint you, but don't let it change your heart." He nodded, his voice steady. "I promise." She smiled faintly. "Good," she said. That's all I needed to hear. Not long after that, her daughter noticed the changes too. One day she came home early to find her mother sitting quietly, staring at the garden. "Mom," she said gently, "what are you thinking about?" The old woman smiled faintly. "I'm just remembering the days when I could do everything on my own." Her daughter sat beside her. "You don't have to do everything now," she said. "You have people who love you." Her mother nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." That weekend, when the young man came by, her daughter invited him to stay for dinner. They sat together, sharing stories and laughter. The house felt full again, filled with the kind of warmth that had been missing for years. After dinner, as they were saying goodbye, her daughter thanked him. "You've made a difference in her life," she said. He smiled humbly. "She's made a difference in mine too." As time went on, his visits became less about helping and more about being there. He became part of their family in a quiet, natural way. He would come by to help with errands, fix small things around the house, or just sit and talk. Sometimes, when her memory failed her, he would tell her stories about herself, the ones she had once told him. She would laugh and listen as if hearing them for the first time, and in those moments her eyes would light up again, even if only for a short while. One day she asked him to help her with something special. "I have an old box upstairs," she said. "Can you bring it here?" He nodded and went to fetch it. The box was covered in dust, filled with old letters and keepsakes. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of yellowed paper. "These are all the letters my husband wrote me," she said softly. "I kept every single one." She smiled wistfully. "He used to say the kindest words. I think that's why I still believe in goodness." They spent the afternoon reading a few of those letters together. The words were gentle and full of love, written in neat handwriting that time hadn't erased. Each letter carried a story, a memory, a promise that still lingered. When they finished, she looked at him and said, "I hope one day you find someone who loves you like that." He smiled and replied, "I think I already have someone who shows me what love really looks like." She looked at him puzzled for a second, then smiled, realizing what he meant. Winter came and the days grew colder. The garden, once filled with color, now lay quiet under a blanket of frost. The old woman stayed indoors more often, wrapped in her favorite shawl, her body weaker now. Still, whenever he visited, she would find the strength to smile. "I was waiting for you," she would say. And he would always reply, "I told you I'd come." One snowy afternoon, they sat by the fireplace. She was quiet, her eyes fixed on the flames. After a long pause, she said softly, "Do you believe people meet for a reason?" He nodded. "I do," he said. "I think everything happens when it's meant to." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe you were meant to remind me that there's still kindness in the world." He looked at her, his heart heavy but full. "And maybe you were meant to remind me that kindness matters." She reached out her frail hand and he took it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not walking past me that day." He smiled, his eyes wet. "Thank you for letting me be part of your life." They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling softly between them. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet white. That night, as he walked home through the snow, he felt a strange peace. He looked back once, seeing the faint light from her window. He knew she was watching too, smiling as she always did. The bond they shared had grown into something unspoken and pure, something neither time nor distance could take away. In her room, she looked at the photo of her husband on the bedside table and smiled softly. "I wasn't alone after all," she whispered. She closed her eyes, her heart full, and for the first time in a long while she felt completely at peace, surrounded by the memory of love and the kindness that had found her when she needed it most. The morning after the snowstorm, the young man walked quickly through the narrow street, his hands deep in his pockets. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't care. He carried a small bag with freshly baked bread and her favorite jam. He always brought something whenever he visited. The old woman's house stood at the end of the lane, its chimney sending a thin curl of smoke into the air. But today something felt different. The air was too quiet. No sound of the kettle, no faint hum from her little radio. Just silence. He knocked gently at first, then again. When there was no answer, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The warmth of the house greeted him, but she wasn't in her usual chair. Her shawl was folded neatly on the couch and her teacup sat on the table half full. He called her name softly, but there was no reply. Then he saw her daughter coming down the stairs, her eyes red from crying. His heart sank. She looked at him, trying to speak, but her voice broke. "She passed away in her sleep last night," she whispered. He froze, unable to move. For a moment, the room seemed to blur around him. He placed the bag on the table, his hands trembling slightly. I saw her yesterday," he said quietly. She was smiling. Her daughter nodded. "She told me last night that she felt at peace." There was a long silence between them, filled with the weight of goodbye. The funeral was simple, just as the old woman had wanted. A few close neighbors, her daughter and the young man, stood quietly as the snow fell softly around them. He held a small white rose, his fingers cold but steady. When it was his turn to say something, he stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "She taught me that kindness doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be real. She showed me what it means to care for someone without expecting anything back." His voice cracked slightly, but he finished with a soft smile. "She was family to me." After the service, her daughter approached him. "She left something for you," she said, handing him a small envelope with his name written on it in her delicate handwriting. He held it carefully, his chest tight. When he got home, he sat at his desk and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note and a small old-fashioned key. The letter began with her familiar tone. "My dear boy, if you're reading this, it means I've gone to join the people I've missed for so long. Please don't be sad. You gave me more joy in these past months than I've felt in years. You reminded me that goodness still exists. You helped me see that I was never truly alone." He paused, his eyes wet as he continued reading. "There's a small chest in my bedroom closet. The key you have belongs to it. Everything inside is for you. Not because you helped me, but because you cared without asking for anything in return. You gave me back my faith in people. So now, I want to give you something that might change your life the way you changed mine." His hands shook as he read the last lines. "Take it and use it wisely. Remember what I always told you, keep your heart warm even when the world feels cold. Love always the old woman who was never really lost." He sat still for a long time, the letter resting in his lap. Finally, he wiped his eyes and went back to her house. Her daughter was still there, sorting through old things. When he showed her the letter, she smiled softly. "She told me about that," she said. "It's in the back of her closet." Together, they went upstairs. The room was filled with the faint smell of lavender and old wood. In the corner, under a blanket, was a small wooden chest. The lock was old but still strong. He took the key and opened it slowly. Inside were several envelopes, some jewelry, and a thick folder filled with papers. On top of everything was another note. "This is my way of saying thank you." He opened the folder and froze. Inside were documents, property deeds, bank statements, and letters addressed to her lawyer. It didn't make sense at first, but as he flipped through them, he realized what it meant. She had left everything to him. The old woman had been quietly wealthy, but she had lived simply, never showing it. Her daughter smiled through tears. "She told me she wanted to help you. She said you reminded her of what mattered most." He didn't know what to say. "I can't take this," he whispered. But her daughter shook her head. "You already earned it," she said. "You gave her back happiness. That's something no money can buy." He stood there speechless, staring at the chest that represented a lifetime of her trust. It wasn't the wealth that moved him, it was what it meant. It was her way of saying he mattered, that his kindness had not gone unseen, that helping someone without expecting anything could lead to the most unexpected gifts of all. Weeks passed, but the ache in his chest didn't fade. He kept visiting her house, helping her daughter pack away her things. Sometimes he would just sit in the garden, even though the flowers were gone for the season. He could almost hear her voice in the wind, gentle and reassuring. One day, as he sat there, her daughter joined him. "You know," she said softly, "my mother used to say that everyone meets one person who changes their life. I think you were that person for her." He looked down at his hands. She changed mine too. As spring arrived, he decided to do something in her memory. He took part of what she had left him and opened a small community garden in the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, just a small piece of land with flowers, benches, and a sign that read, "For those who believe kindness still matters." He named it after her. Every weekend, families came, children played, and people shared stories. It became a place of peace, just like her old garden had been. Her daughter often visited, helping him plant new flowers. One afternoon, she brought him a small photo in a silver frame. It was of the old woman sitting in her garden, smiling at the camera. "She would have loved this place," she said. He smiled, placing the photo under the shade of a young tree. "She's here," he said quietly. "Every time someone smiles, she's here." Over time, the story of the old woman and the young man spread around the neighborhood. People would stop by and ask about her, and he would tell them how they met, how she had been standing alone, ignored by everyone, and how a simple act of kindness had changed both their lives. The story touched many hearts. It reminded people to slow down, to look around, and to notice those who might be quietly struggling. Years later, he became known for his compassion. The garden grew into a larger project that helped elderly people in the community. He never forgot the lessons she taught him: to be gentle, to be patient, and to never turn away from someone who needed help. And sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees, he could almost hear her voice saying, "I told you kindness would take you far." On the anniversary of her passing, he placed a single white rose on her grave, the same kind he had held at her funeral. He stood there for a while, the breeze cool against his face. "You were right," he whispered. "Kindness really does come back." Then he smiled, not with sadness, but with quiet gratitude. As he walked away, he passed by a young boy helping an elderly man cross the street. It made him stop and smile. Maybe that was how it started again. One small act of care passing from one heart to another, just like it had all those years ago, when he took the hand of a lost old woman and found a story that would change his life forever.